The following is a presentation of the Steamboat Church of Christ in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. We hope that you find today's lesson, presented by our minister, Dr. Joseph Becker, informative, insightful, and inspirational.
For the last 13 weeks, we've been studying the Lord's sixth post-resurrection appearance, his third to the apostles, his appearance on the shore of the Sea of Tiberias, focusing for the last 3 weeks on John 21:15 through 17, where the following is recorded. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Feed my lambs." He said to him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he had said the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." Now, in most Bibles, just before this passage, there's a section break with a new heading. And the heading there will usually say something like, Peter restored. Now, these headings aren't part of the text. They're editorial. But they stand as evidence that in the view of a great many Bible scholars, what is happening in John 21:15 through 19 is that Peter is being restored. And I think that's right. However, that rubric begs the question, restored to what? And that is the question that we've been exploring for the last 3 weeks. What was Peter's office in the church? What was his station? What appointment had Peter been given beyond that of apostle, which would have required confirmation by Christ after he had thrice denied the Lord? Well, for the last 3 weeks, we've been studying that question by examining a variety of titles or monikers by which Peter has been known historically in the church. And if you want to hear more about the relative merits of regarding Peter as the Bishop of Rome, or as the Pope, or as the Pontiff, I invite you to go online and listen to the 3 lessons prior to this one, numbers 393, 394, and 395 there. Today, however, I want to take a different approach to the question of Peter's office. A few months ago, I was in Wichita and was visiting with a friend, an elder of one of the congregations there, and our conversation went long into the night. And toward the end of our time together, he was asking for my advice in regard to ministering to a family with which he and I are both acquainted. And he told me about a recent occurrence in which he had visited their home, and the situation that he discovered there was so upsetting to him that he found himself set at naught. He had gone there with the intention of doing some good, but when he entered the home, what he witnessed there was so much more far gone, so much more extreme than he had ever imagined, that it was all he could do to simply keep his composure. And when he left, he felt like he hadn't accomplished very much. He felt badly about that, because he loves these people, and he wanted to do what he could, both physically and spiritually, to help this family set its ship aright. And he told me part of the problem was that things were such a shipwreck that I was overwhelmed, and I didn't know where to begin. But another part of the problem, the part that troubles me more, was my own heart. Because what I found in that house was so offensive to me that my disgust overwhelmed my love. And he continued, "I know that in your work in Houston you ran into that kind of thing all the time. Tell me how you did it." Adding, "I don't want to get to the point that such things don't bother me. I don't want to dull my senses of right and wrong, and I know that your senses aren't dull, yet you have been able to work closely with people deeply entrenched in immoral situations. How did you do it?" And I said, "Well, the answer is simple, but it isn't easy. The concept is basic, but putting the concept into practice takes a great deal of spiritual wherewithal. It really just comes down to 6 words." And my friend leaned forward because he wanted to make sure he got those 6 words. And I said, "Start with is rather than ought." He furrowed his brow. And I said, "You and I, we've been studying the Bible all of our lives. We were both raised in Christian households, and we both have a highly developed sense of how things ought to be. And that's such a high priority with us that we've allowed that to be our starting point. We start with ought. And we evaluate everything we encounter by that standard, the standard of how things ought to be. And by that standard, we find everything wanting. That's why you and I both are melancholy at heart, because nothing in this world is as it ought to be. And we live in a constant state of frustration and disappointment. And the further we wade into the world, the more overwhelming the incongruity between how things are and how they ought to be becomes, until you can't even see the pathway between the two anymore. Some years ago, I figured out that the reason why I was unable to help people get to where they ought to be was because I was failing to fully assess and appreciate where they are. I'd become so accustomed to dismissing is for all its inadequacies and leading with ought that I was unable to identify a pathway between the two. But Jesus always started with is. And I find that when I start with is rather than ought, I not only get better results, but I'm happier as well. And my friend looked at me and said, I'm going to do my best to try to forget that by morning. But I don't think I can. It's about the best thing I've heard in a long time. Now, those of you who know me know that this is the way that I approach a lot of things. I've never lost my sense of ought. But I know that that isn't the place to start with anything, really. The place to start is with is. And that's what we've been doing for the last 3 weeks in regard to Peter. Because as we've been studying Peter's office, his position in the church, we've been looking mostly at how things are rather than how things ought to be. Taking the approach of contrasting the lowest possible view of Peter, the view that's held among evangelicals, with the highest possible view of Peter, the view that's held in the Church of Rome. And I've been pointing out the comparative merits and the demerits of those two extreme points of view. But I've said nothing, or almost nothing, about how we ought to view Peter and to understand his role in the church. And that's what I want to begin to do today. And I have to tell you that I'm glad to be moving on from evaluating doctrines of faith by comparing them one to another. In Romans 14:1-12, Paul tells us, "As for the one who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel over differences of discernment. One person believes he may eat anything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. Let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. Who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It is before his own master that he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand. One person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord, and the one who eats, eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while the one who abstains, abstains in honor of the Lord, and gives thanks to God. Even in matters of life and death, none of us is self-effectual. No, if we live in behalf of the Lord. And if we die in behalf of the Lord. For even in our living and dying, we are the Lord's. For to this end Christ died and lived again, that he might be Lord both of the dead and of the living. So on what basis do you pass judgment on your brother? On what basis do you despise your brother? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. For it is written, As I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow, and every tongue shall confess to God. Accordingly, each of us will give an account of himself to God. And I take that seriously. I mean, there are preachers in our brotherhood who feel perfectly comfortable, perfectly at ease, making very broad statements about whole swaths of Christian brethren based on one belief or another that they might hold. And I'm not of a mind to do so. And this doesn't just go for small differences in doctrine from one Christian to the next. No, I mean, how many times have you heard someone take a magnifying glass and tweezers to somebody else's beliefs and say, well, I think they're wrong about that, but this is not a matter of salvation. So this is not worth parting company over. As though the ties of fellowship ought to be on the table every time a doctrinal difference is discussed. Maybe we can let the small stuff slide, but Every doctrinal difference needs to be weighed for its severity before the most extreme measures can be taken off the table. But beloved, that's like insisting that the death penalty be considered for all crimes. And it goes completely against what Paul says here. I mean, yes, Paul starts off with a question of scruples over dietary practices. But in verse 7 of Romans 14, he raises the stakes, and he raises them considerably. Because according to Paul, every person who bears the name of Christ is his, and his alone, to judge, not just in doubtful matters, but in matters of life and death. When Paul talks about living unto the Lord and dying unto the Lord, he isn't talking about lifestyle, he's talking about commitment. Every brother and sister in Christ walking this earth has put his or her life in the Lord's hands, and his or her death in his hands as well. And when they stand for the judgment, they will stand before him and him alone, just as you and I will. But right here, right now, the life that that person has dedicated to the Lord is just as genuinely the Lord's as is the life that you or I or anyone else has dedicated to him, without regard to the degree to which that person's faith and practice conforms to the mandates of Scriptures as I understand them. Of that, I am as certain as I am about any biblical truth. And as such, I want to assure everyone listening to me today that on those occasions when I do call out another Christian faith tradition, most recently Roman Catholicism, and talk about the merits or demerits of one or another of the doctrines of that tradition, it's my intent to do so with no contempt, apart from what I hope is a godly contempt for falsehood. As Paul says in Ephesians 4:11 through 16, Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and teachers to equip his people for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of God, to the end that we would no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of people in their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is, Christ. From him the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love as each part does its work. So I'm glad to be moving on from the last three sermons, because I never feel like I am on thinner ice than when I'm making critical judgments about the beliefs of Christians in other traditions, even though that's an essential part of articulating what is. And as I said earlier, I think it's essential to start with is before moving on to ought, but move on we must. So what is the ought here? How ought we to understand the office of Peter? And more importantly, how should our view of Peter affect how we go about living into our faith and practice as word-centered Christians? Well, for the answer to that question, I think we should start with Peter's job description as it is recorded for us in Matthew 16:18 through 19, where Jesus says to Peter, "And I tell you that you are Peter, the rock, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Now, as job descriptions go, this one is very concise, because verse 18 is actually not part of the description. Verse 18 is more like a memo or an award letter saying, "Congratulations, you got the job." The job description proper is confined to verse 19. And according to that verse, Peter is the keymaster of the kingdom of heaven, and in that position he has one job, and one job mainly, to lock some locks and open some others. That is the meaning of the words bind and loose in this verse. To bind, deo, means to lock up, to bind as with chains. To loose, luo, means to set free, to unbind, to release. Now that isn't Peter's only job. He's still an apostle with all the rights and responsibilities that come with that position. But as keymaster, his job is to lock some locks and to open some others. Now, obviously, this is a metaphor. The keys are metaphorical keys, and the locks are metaphorical locks. But the job isn't a metaphor. The job is the reality to which the metaphor points. This is a real job, and it comes with real job duties, real rights, and real responsibilities. Because on Sunday, May 24, 33 AD, when the day of Pentecost was to come, 50 days after the resurrection of Christ, the Lord would establish his church, and for the next 34 years, 1 month, and 6 days, till Thursday, June 29, 67 AD, the traditional date of Peter's death, Peter would be at the helm of the church. Now, Christ is the head of the church. As Paul tells us in Colossians 1, 15 through 18, the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together, and he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. Christ is the head of the church, and Peter in no way and by no means supplants Christ. But as the head of the church, as the great shepherd of the church, Christ appointed Peter to be his under-shepherd on earth. And his choice of Peter for that job wasn't an afterthought. As I pointed out last week, the word apostle itself, that is, the Greek word apostolos, means the sent ones. And yes, it was the apostles that Jesus sent out to preach the gospel, but the first sense in which the apostles are to be understood as the sent ones lies in the evidence that long before Jesus ever sent the 12 out into the world, the Father sent them to him. When at the beginning of the gospel accounts we find Jesus first selecting his 12 apostles, there's no indication that he undertook any kind of major quest to find them. We have nothing in the Bible, for instance, like the story of King Arthur, who traveled to the ends of the earth in search of just the right men to sit at his round table, which men had to prove themselves worthy by performing feats of daring do. No, Jesus doesn't have to search high and low for his apostles. He returns to civilization from his 40-day sojourn in the desert, and the apostles seem to be ready to hand. Jesus doesn't go looking for them. In most cases, their paths simply cross as if by divine providence, and Jesus says, "Come, follow me." There are no auditions, no tryouts, no application to be an apostle. This isn't The Voice, or So You Think You Can Dance. No, in Galatians 1:15, Paul, speaking of his calling as an apostle, tells us, "God set me apart from my mother's womb and called me by his grace." And this would seem to indicate that God the Father chose the apostles himself and had been preparing them since the time they were conceived for the work to which he would send them. And indeed, he does send them, delivering them to the Son, placing them directly in his path, ready to serve. Peter was always going to be an apostle, and he was always going to be the first of the apostles. That's how he's identified in Matthew 10:2, long before there was any talk of him being the Keymaster. These are the names of the 12 apostles. The first, Simon, who's called Peter. And the Greek word there that's translated first is the word protos, which means first in order, first in rank, or first in type. Now, we know from John 1:40-42 that Peter was not the first apostle, chronologically speaking. He was not the first to be called. Andrew was the first to be called. Peter was second. So Matthew's reference to Peter as the first has to mean first in rank, or first in type. And the gospel writers seem to be united in their characterization of Peter as the first among the apostles, because despite other variations, Peter takes the first position in the list of the apostles provided for us in Mark 3 and in Luke 6. Moreover, Peter almost always takes the premier position whenever the apostles are mentioned in the Bible. There are 3 apostles in Jesus' inner circle, Peter, James, and John, and the first among these is always Peter. Who's present at the raising of the daughter of Jairus? Peter, James, and John. Who's present at the transfiguration? Peter, James, and John. And at that event, it's Peter who speaks for the other 3. Who's present with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane? Peter, James, and John. And in Matthew's account, the other two aren't even named. Matthew 26:37, he took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee along with him. And according to both Matthew and Mark, when the three of them fell asleep, it is Peter who Jesus holds responsible. Matthew 26:40, and he came to the disciples and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, "So could you not watch with me for 1 hour?" When Christ arose from the dead and began to make appearances before men, to which apostle did he appear first? According to Paul in 1 Corinthians 15:5, it was Peter, Cephas. Indeed, according to Luke 24, Peter is the only apostle who got a private appearance of the risen Lord. Then in John 21, Jesus singles Peter out, appointing him to be his under-shepherd on earth. And as I pointed out a couple of weeks ago, there's more going on in that passage than simply Jesus forgiving Peter for having denied him on the night of his crucifixion. John, who records this event, is the apostle that Jesus loved. And in this passage, the Lord grants it to John that he may live out his life without suffering a martyr's death. However, as blessed as John is, he is not blessed the same as Peter. And John paints a very poignant picture of this fact. Because according to John 21:20, even though John is the apostle that Jesus loved, it isn't John who walks side by side with Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Tiberias. And it isn't John who Jesus appoints as his under-shepherd. Jesus and Peter walk side by side, while John follows behind. And that isn't happenstance. Within the scope of this appointment, within the scope of Peter's ordination as the Lord's proxy shepherd on earth, Christ elevates Peter to the level of his peer, as his co-shepherd at his side. No one else gets that privilege. Peter alone is commissioned to feed the Lord's sheep. John is merely a witness to this event. And John defers to Peter. As Peter and the Lord walk side by side, John follows behind. John isn't the under-shepherd, and neither is Andrew, James the son of Zebedee, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanite, Matthias, James the brother of Jesus, Paul, Barnabas, Silas, Timothy, Apollos, Andronicus, Epaphroditus, or Junius. Now in John 10:11-13, Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he's a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. Yet he asks Peter to take care of his flock." And that can only mean that in the eyes of the Lord, Peter is not a hired hand. No, Peter is a shepherd in good standing, qualified in Christ's esteem to act in the stead of the great shepherd. And we see the proof of Peter as a good shepherd in Acts 4:19-20, where the Pharisees, like wolves, tried to scatter the sheep. And Peter, who was not a hired hand, but the ordained shepherd of the flock, did not run away, but stayed and defended the sheep, saying, "Which is right in God's eyes, to listen to you or to him? You be the judges. As for us, we cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard." Because Peter, from all appearances, took his role as shepherd of the flock seriously. In Acts 1:15, it's Peter who stands up and takes the lead, appointing Matthias to be the apostle to take the place of Judas. In Acts 2:14, it's Peter who stands up and, speaking for all the apostles, preaches the first gospel sermon. And in such passages, Peter doesn't just get top billing, he gets feature billing. Acts 2:14, Peter stood up with the 11. Acts 2:37, Peter and the rest of the apostles. Acts 5:29, Peter and the other apostles. And the primacy of Peter isn't limited to those early days of the church. Peter not only continued to be the leading pioneer of the early church, being the first apostle to go to the Gentiles, Acts 10, and the first of the apostles to receive miraculous deliverance from prison, Acts 12, but he remains the leader of the early church for the rest of his life. In the book of Galatians, Paul reveals that he was required to undergo evaluation and to defend his calling and his ministry to Peter. And even though Paul seems to resent the fact that he's required to defer to Peter, in Galatians 2:7-9, Paul makes it clear that not only was Peter the go-to guy when it came to getting approval from the other apostles, but when it came to apostolic authority, that is, when it came to the bona fide authority granted to the apostles by God, Peter was the gold standard. Galatians 2:7-8, But they recognized that I had been entrusted with the task of preaching the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised. For God, who was at work in Peter as an apostle to the circumcised, was also at work in me as an apostle to the Gentiles. Despite the fact that Paul finds it hectoring that Peter is his superior in the church, nevertheless he recognizes that fact and he defers to Peter. He respects his office, and he does so by conceding that the reason his own apostleship is judged to be authentic is because it rises to a level comparable with that of Peter. Peter is the standard. But why? Why is Peter the standard? What is it about Peter? Was he the best educated? No. Paul was far more educated than Peter. Was he the one with the best character? Probably not. Peter had many flaws, and he knew it. Was he the most loving? No. John is the apostle of love. Was it a matter of nepotism? No. James, the brother of the Lord, held the most nepotic position among the apostolate. Was he the purest in heart? No. Andrew was the apostle with no guile. Was he the best looking? No. All records indicate that it was Thaddeus who was known for his boyish good looks. Was he the most positive and encouraging of the apostles? Was he the most avuncular? No. That credit goes to Barnabas. So what was so special about Peter? Why did he hold the position in the church that he did? Well, in the case of Peter, it wasn't what he had that made him special, but what he was given. Because Peter, and Peter alone, was given the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And when Christ conferred those keys upon Peter, he put Peter in a class by himself. You may recall that a couple of weeks ago I demonstrated to you how it was that Eliakim may be a type and shadow of Peter, because in Isaiah 22:22, God, among other things, says of Eliakim, I will place on his shoulder the key to the house of David. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open. However, there's a third person in the Bible of whom this exact language is used, and that person is Christ, the Lord. In Revelation 3:7, Christ, speaking to John, says, to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, these are the words of him who is holy and true, who holds the key of David. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open. So it could be that Eliakim is a type and shadow of Christ rather than a type and shadow of Peter, but don't miss the bigger point. Because when Christ here refers to himself as the Keymaster, whose locking and unlocking cannot be countermanded, he is also saying something astonishing about Peter. Because in Matthew 16:19, the Lord confers those very qualities on Peter, declaring that by his hand, by his word, by his decree, he is granting to Peter that he too is to be the Keymaster, whose locking and unlocking cannot be countermanded. That's the job description of Peter. According to Matthew 16:19, Peter is the Keymaster of the kingdom of heaven, and in that position he has one job and one job mainly, to lock some locks and to unlock some others. Now, stop and let that sink in for a moment, because what that means is that whatsoever Peter has locked is closed to us, and no one can open it. And whatsoever Peter has unlocked is open to us, and no one can close it. And with that in view, I think that it would behoove us to make a study of Peter's clythropoic endeavors, because that is what makes Peter the arbiter of faith and practice in the church. And as such, it is in our best interest to know which locks Peter locked and which locks he unlocked. And that's where we'll pick up next week. That's my lesson for today.
This has been a presentation of the Steamboat Church of Christ. We hope that you have found Dr. Becker's message well appointed. To hear more lessons like this one, visit our website at www.steamboatchurch.org or come see us at 1698 Lincoln Avenue in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. Bible classes are Sunday mornings at 9:30 and worship services are at 10:30. We look forward to meeting you. Until then, may the grace and peace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you.